Okay, well, good morning, everyone. And I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you, Joe, very much. I think Professor Staples' speech was going to be a very hard act to follow. And as I was putting this together, I was thinking, you know, if I introduce the topic by talking about the economy, I know somebody else is going to talk about the economy. So anyway, so here goes. This may be a little bit repetitive, but anyway, it's really important. You know, the news this week was very shocking. On Monday, as Professor Staples pointed out, the GDP was announced that it shrank an annualized 1.6% in the third quarter. And this was after a 7.1% drop in the second quarter. And so this is the technical definition of a recession, right? 2 consecutive quarters. And this is the third recession that Japan has had since 2008. And this was triggered by this tax increase, which was an important component of what Prime Minister Abe had promised when he came to office a couple of years ago. The next day, one economist from the Daiichi Life Research Institute said that the tax increase completely destroyed Japan's economy, as he put it. No sector was spared. And it was another example of how politicians should learn from the bad experience of tax increase. The International New York Times the next day also said, and I quote here, "Japan's grand economic experiment or combination of fiscal discipline and monetary stimulus is collapsing." And not only that, but they said that this will have all sorts of knock-on effects because Europe is looking at what Japan is doing and will probably decide not to follow the Japanese model, at least that part of it, the tax increase part of it. So what happened? What happened to Japan? In 2012, you had a new government coming into office, and it looked like a grand opportunity, golden opportunity, to get Japan moving again. To paraphrase John F. Kennedy, let's get the economy moving again. And Abe came out with his 3 arrows program, which I'll be talking about in a bit, which is mostly monetary easing, a short-term fiscal stimulus, and fundamental structural reforms. And those 3 things together, that would be the golden elixir which would get the Japanese economy moving again. Well, what happened to the economy? It's off the rails again, and can it get back? And so this is a critical time for us to look at not only the Japanese economy, as Professor Staples so well introduced it, but also to look at Japanese politics, because there are some fundamental issues that we need to think about in terms of politics. You know, I study what we call political economy, and political economy is, you know, the relationship between the politics and the economics. It's always there. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. There's also a discussion of what's called a 4th arrow, and that's where we get to the idea of, you know, I should advance that, the idea of nationalism involved in this whole thing. And this term was invented by a scholar in Canada, Wendy Dobson, and she called it the 4th arrow, which includes Japan's increased defense posture and increased defense spending. It's historical revisionism, that is trying to look at all these historical issues which some people thought were kind of solved maybe 20 years ago, and now they want to kind of go backwards, sort of retrograde movement. Nationalism connected with that, and territorial intransigence. You know, Japan has major territorial disputes with 3 of its neighbors. That's almost unprecedented in modern history. This is a country that prides itself as being sort of isolated from the rest of the world, yet they have major territorial hassles with 3 of their neighbors, and there's no evidence that there's going to be any possible compromise on any of those 3. So all of that together, I think, is perhaps as important as the economic stuff, this 4th arrow, and that's why I titled this Nationalism and the 3 Arrows, because the real agenda that a lot of people have talked about, that Prime Minister Abe is interested in, is promoting his version of Japanese nationalism. Now, he tried to do that fulsomely back in 2006, 2007, when he was first Prime Minister, and it didn't work so well. So this time, wisely, he focused on the economy first. So let's give you a little background. to see how we got to where we are today. And we start with the basics of the Japanese political system that operated through most of the post-war era. It's often called the 1955 system. And without getting into all the gory details, which you're probably not that interested in, basically what you had was one hegemonic party which dominated the political system for most of that period. And it's called the 1955 system because that's the year that the Liberal Democratic Party, the fusion of two basically conservative parties, came together. And they dominated the Diet throughout this whole period. They won almost every election. Their support would dip for a while but then come back. And then you had a smaller major opposition party, the Japan Socialist Party, which never got more than about half of the strength that the LDP had. Now the two parties were much different. The LDP was based primarily in the countryside and had support of big business. So we talked about a rice and steel coalition. It also increasingly got support from the suburbs. The Japan Socialist Party, its problem is that it was based in urban areas, that is central urban areas, and based on labor unions, and it never seemed to get much beyond that. It couldn't really get out into the middle class. And that was the key battle, is who was going to get the rising middle class in Japan. And the LDP, usually because they had more resources, was able to win that battle. A number of small opposition parties were formed, but they never really got much traction and were not able to get more than a few seats in the Diet. And underlying all of this was a multi-member district system. That is, you had one vote, one non-transferable vote, but you got maybe 3, 4, 5 members of the Diet in your district. So you had to think as a voter strategically how you were going to vote. As a candidate for office, you had to think very carefully how you did your campaign, because you were going to be, in some cases, competing against people from your own party. So they had to run enough people so that they could get at least a couple of them in the top tier that would be selected, but not too many people so they'd cut up the vote too much. So you had these, it was very important for you to build a support base so you could turn out your voters on election day, and that meant you had to have your own machine to produce the votes. And that required a lot of money. These things were called koenkai. And so money politics played a huge role in Japanese politics during this era, and most of the scandals involved money. So this was kind of a strange system that operated, but it seemed to work fairly well because the LDP was in power and supported by business. They mostly had pro-business policies, and the economy seemed to be humming most of the time. So the system, people put up with it. In the early 90s, this whole system begins to break down. And what happens is a number of things after the end of the Cold War. First of all, the end of the Cold War ends this basic ideological divide between this essentially conservative pro-American party and a socialist party that's willing to make accommodations with the Soviet Union, China, and so forth. So that has ended. The bubble economy collapses. With the end of the bubble economy, economic concerns that had been largely submerged come to the surface. People are disgruntled. People are upset about the economy. A lot of demands for political reform to get rid of this money politics, which so tainted the system. And the response to this by the LDP leadership was to come out with an electoral plan that basically favored the LDP. And a number of members of the LDP were very upset about it, and 47 of them just walked out of their party. And it caused the government to collapse. And they called an election. This was in the summer of 1993. And you had a 7-party coalition came to power. This is the first time since the 1940s we have an opposition coalition that comes to power. And I have musical accompaniment. Great. Okay. And job one of this new coalition is to come up with a new electoral system, which they do. But because it's a fractious coalition of 7 parties, they have to actually get support from the LDP in order to get this thing through the Diet. And that causes the coalition basically to start splintering and dissolving. Well, what they created was a hybrid system involving both proportional representation, that is, you voted nationally, and depending on the proportion of the vote, seats would be allocated. That was about 200 seats. And then the other 300 seats were single-member district seats, kind of like you would have in English-speaking countries, like that. So what it did, it totally changed the nature of campaigning. It changed the nature of the political system in Japan. It meant, as one author put it, it was a shift from karaoke politics to kabuki politics. Now, do any of you like karaoke? Maybe you'll get a chance to do that this evening, go do karaoke. Okay, what is karaoke? How does it work? You know. Right. Well, you have the same music. It's always the same. The singer changes, the music is always the same. And that's the way Japanese politics was before 1994. The politicians changed, the music was always the same. But in kabuki, what happens? Any of you seen kabuki? Maybe you get a chance while you're here in Japan. Kabuki is all about individualized performances. You have great actors who have these wonderful followings, and they're stars. And if you can really be a great actor, you gain this sort of theatrical immortality. And that's what you began to see, is more individualized campaigning, more focus on policy, especially what we call party manifestos that were produced. The rise of something like, kind of like a two-party system in Japan, at least for a while. You had two competitive parties until one of them melted down. And in the last three elections, you've had sort of party-centered swings between the parties, and not necessarily candidate-driven. And so you begin to get a lot of changes in the political system. Now, curiously, after all this happened, you had the LDP actually comes back into power. And by the way, I should identify who these people are. That was, that was Miyazawa, who was the last LDP prime minister before the earthquake there. That was Hosokawa, the leader of the coalition. And anyway, so this man, whoopsie daisy, I still can't do that. That's Hashimoto. He was the LDP prime minister. He comes back the LDP gets back into power, curiously, by forming a coalition with the longtime opposition party, the Socialists. And this man, Murayama, with these luxurious eyebrows here that he had, he becomes the prime minister. So, and that's probably the biggest mistake this Japan Socialist Party ever made, and it was the beginning of the end for them, because it was like Luke Skywalker joining with Darth Vader or something like that. It was not a very smart move on their part, and they lost a lot of their support as a result of that. But one thing Murayama did is he issued this thing called the Murayama Statement in 1995, which is the strongest statement ever by any Japanese government of apology and remorse for what happened during the 1930s and 1940s. And now the government is talking about getting rid of it. Anyway, the most interesting character during this whole period of the new politics after 1994 is Koizumi. And I thought at the time that Koizumi-san was the herald of a new kind of politics in Japan. He was the ultimate kabuki politician, right? Just his appearance. He doesn't look like your typical Japanese politician, right? They usually have the slick-backed hair with the greasy kid stuff in the hair. They have these glasses with the plastic on top and the wire underneath, and they all look like they're turned out of an assembly line or something. But he looked different. Even his hair, his nickname was Lionheart, partly because he looked kind of like a lion because of the mane of hair. He was an Elvis fan. He got to dress up as his idol in one of Elvis's costumes, and he danced with Richard Gere after the movie Let's Dance came out. And so he was very popular because he was good at sound bites. He was good at turning phrases. He was charismatic, at least in the Japanese context. And most importantly, he had a reform program. And that attracted the imagination of the Japanese people. Some of the things he wanted to do, he talked about destroying the party, destroying his own party. That's almost like Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution saying bombard the headquarters or something like that. But what he meant by that was he wanted to reform the party the way the LDP did business. It was a faction-driven party. It It was split up into these little fiefdoms and kingdoms. He wanted it to be a national party where they were all working together. So he sent out these young candidates to run for nominations for the Diet, and he called them assassins. They were actually to take out these old leaders and all of that. He wanted to greatly reform the budget, to get rid of state-run companies, subsidies. In the Japanese budget system, there's all these little honeypots here and there that politicians use, like Professor Staples was referring to fund special projects and what we call in American politics pork barrel politics. That is, things that members of the Diet use to get themselves reelected by going home and saying, look at all these projects I got for our district, that kind of thing. He wanted to change the financial system to get rid of all the debt, the private debt that had accumulated, what we call NPLs or non-performing loans. And they did. They worked a lot of that debt out of the system and reformed the banking system. And the most important thing was the postal system, which also Professor Staples referred to. That seemed like a strange thing to focus on, the postal system, and, delivering the letters or something. But as he mentioned in his presentation, it's also the biggest bank in Japan and the biggest insurance company in Japan. It's over $3 trillion of money that's just sitting there. And why was it sitting there? It was, again, one of these huge honeypots that the government was using to distribute money, mostly for infrastructure projects around the country. And a lot of it was these bridges to nowhere and concert halls that seated 5,000 people in a town that only had 3,000 people, and stuff like that. Those are exaggerations. There weren't many of those cases, but a lot of the money seemed to be wasted and didn't really help the economy. He said, let's break up that whole system and funnel that money into the economy for more productive investment. And he actually got that plan passed through the Diet. Now, it's been watered down quite a bit since then, and will it be an effective reform? But at least he tried, and I think that's why the Japanese people really took to him. They thought, this man is really trying to do something different. And so, his successor, when Koizumi-san decides to step down, it seems like a natural, is Abe. He's going to come into office because he's been the chief cabinet secretary. He rose through the party. He seemed like a natural to follow Koizumi. He was the youngest prime minister of the century. He was only in his early 50s, 52 years old. He was the first prime minister born after World War II, so appealing to the young. But at the same time, he came from a blue blood political family. He had politicians on both sides of his family. His father was a foreign minister. His grandfather on the other side of the family was a prime minister. One of his grandfathers was a longtime member of the Diet, and so forth. And he had an international experience. He went abroad, studied in the United States for a while, worked in the private sector, then went into the LDP, worked his way up through the party. And he seemed to have a lot of energy and seemed to have a lot of interesting ideas. And he made a very good start. And one of the first things he did was he made a trip to China and Korea. And this was very important because relations between China, Korea, and Japan were terrible during Koizumi, because Koizumi went to visit Yasukuni Shrine. And if you know that issue, I don't want to get into all the complications of that issue, but it's a symbolic issue that gets the Koreans and the Chinese very upset. And they just had nothing to do with Koizumi, as long as he was going to visit Yasukuni Shrine. So what he does, and I thought it was a brilliant gesture, he goes to offer a prayer for peace at Meiji Shrine, which is, I don't know if any of you been to Tokyo, I recommend it. It's one of the most beautiful places in Tokyo. It's a shrine created by the Emperor Meiji in the late 19th century, and it's like a small forest in the middle of Tokyo. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. Again, offers a prayer for peace there. So a wonderful gesture. And he makes this speech talking about he wanted to create a beautiful country, was the term, a beautiful country. Isn't that a wonderful term? I mean, it sounds like he's going to beautify the country, clean it up or something. But what he meant by that, and this gets back to the nationalist bit of this, what he meant by that was that he wanted to create a Japan that was proud of its heritage. and was willing to take its place among the great powers by boosting its defense, by increasing its military role in the world, by becoming, the term of art that was used at the time was becoming a normal nation, doing the things that great powers do. Well, anyway, but things began, so it looked like a good start, but things began to go sour very rapidly. A number of gaffes were made by him and other members of his cabinet. His health minister called women breeding machines. That was the first of a series of very bad gaffes. There were a number of scandals, including the agriculture minister who committed suicide after he had a drunken press conference when he was slurring his words and so forth. Abe got into this major argument over whether the comfort women had existed at all during the 1930s, 1940s. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's another one of these historical issues involving these women who were made into sex slaves during the 1930s, 1940s. And he was basically denying it. And the U.S. House of Representatives immediately passes a resolution saying, no, it happened. It's real. Deal with it. And then the most serious problem of all was the mishandling of pension records of 50 million people. It's approaching half of the population of Japan. The government lost the records of these people. Now, that was not Abe's fault. That was a bureaucratic problem. And if he had been a smart politician, he would have just come out and said that. He would have said, it's not our fault, but we're going to get to the bottom of this. But instead, they just sort of dithered and didn't respond fully to it for several weeks. And then it made it look like the government, rather than the bureaucrats, were really responsible for it. So the LDP was punished, a massive election loss that year, 2007, in the upper house elections. And the Japanese system, if you're the leader of the party and your party does badly in an election, what do? You're supposed to resign. You commit political harakiri, basically. You're done. But he didn't. He hung on for like 4 weeks, and people were, well, what is this guy doing? He should resign. And then suddenly he changes direction and he says, okay, I'm going to resign. And he checks himself into a hospital for nervous exhaustion. It was a really bad performance. And it was like rock bottom for him. And everybody thought, Abe-san is done. He's finished. We've just watched the political suicide, the political death of a major leader in Japan. So everybody wrote him off. He was done. He was finished. He's dead. So he was dead and buried. He's gone, right? Not quite. Sometimes in politics there are second lives, and sometimes there are 9 lives. But anyway, this is, by the way, this is his wife, who got a lot of Yuki, I think is her name, right? Who got a lot of attention while she was First Lady at that time, because they actually held hands together, which is very rare for a Japanese political couple to do. And this was him meeting Bono. It didn't quite have the same effect as when Koizumi was dancing with Richard Gere, but anyway, he was trying on Bono's glasses there. Anyway, so the LDP, but this is not the end for the LDP. The LDP then goes through this same thing 2 more times with Prime Minister Fukuda up here the next year, and then Prime Minister Aso the next year. It was exactly the same thing. They made a promising start, and then immediately there were a series of gaffes and scandals and mistakes and everything, and the popularity plummets, and they're gone after a year. So the same thing happened again. So the LDP, is pretty much finished. And then what happens is this new rising party, the DPJ, the Democratic Party, gains a lot of attention and excitement because they're talking in populist terms. They want to change things for the people, make things better. And so they win this huge victory in 2009, led by Mr. Hatoyama, who becomes the first non-LDP prime minister since the early 90s. And they win the biggest victory of any party up to that point let's see, I don't have the exact figures, but anyway, a huge number of seats in the Diet. It was like close to 300 seats. Massive victory. It seemed like a massive mandate for change. We'll get to that in a minute. So they come into office with a good reform program, and it looks like, you know, a very promising start. But what happens? Exactly the same thing that happened to the three previous LDP prime ministers. One by one, they make a promising start, and then again a series of gaffes and scandals and mess-ups, and they're only in office for a year, each one of them. And it was really sad. Particularly, it was sad for Hatoyama-san, because he came in, he was a real reformer. He really wanted to change things, and he did a lot of stuff that he didn't get credit from the public for. They did a lot of very family-friendly policies to help young families, which the LDP had basically ignored for all those years they were in office. And a lot of things that were he should have really gotten respect for. But he made a huge mistake. He boxed himself into a corner on this one relatively unimportant issue, but an issue he'd made a promise about, which he was going to, there was a U.S. Marine air station in Okinawa called Futenma. And I don't know if any of you followed that issue. But for decades, the Okinawan people have wanted that thing to be moved out of Okinawa altogether. Well, they back 10 years or so ago, they made a deal to relocate it to the northern part of Okinawa Island. And he promised in the election campaign he was going to side with the Okinawans that it should just totally be removed from the island. The U.S. government immediately said, no, this is done. This issue is finished. We have negotiated this. We're not opening negotiations again. The Okinawan government refused to back down from their demand that this thing be removed from Okinawa Island. So he was in a box. And again, Japanese politicians, when they're caught in a situation like that, what do? They resign. Now, if he'd been the American president, what would he have done? He would have changed the subject probably and moved on to something else. But he felt he had to resign. And it was sad. It was a tragedy. It was kind of like a Greek tragedy. This guy who had such promise, and he's gone in less than a year after he's elected in this massive victory. And then, the worst misfortune of all is the DPJ is hit with the worst disaster in post-war Japanese history. The what they call in Japan 3/11, you know, kind of echoing 9/11, the Great Eastern Japan earthquake and nuclear disaster. I mean, this was a trifecta of disaster, right? You have, on March 11th, 2011, you have the fifth largest earthquake ever recorded at least since 1900, 4 major aftershocks, and then 8 to 10 minutes later, it's a giant tsunami traveling at 800 kilometers per hour, 50 to 80 feet high waves. You know, you all saw the video when the tsunami swept inland, swept everything before it. 15,690 people at least, you know, killed, 6,000 injured, 450,000 people evacuated, 3,200 people missing still, 300,000 people, according to the latest figures I saw, still homeless or in shelters and so forth. So a huge disaster. And Mother Nature wasn't done. It saved the worst for last, because the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was then hit by a 15-meter tsunami, which knocked out the power supply to the nuclear reactor. I mean, this is critical for a nuclear reactor. You've got to keep power, to keep the water circulating, to keep the nuclear rods cool, you know, so that even though you've shut down the plant, those things are still hot for a long time afterward. And that's why they started to melt down, and that was the beginning of the disaster. And now, probably any government that had been in power at that time would have had difficulty dealing with this situation, the LDP or whoever. But unfortunately, Prime Minister Khan was seen as not being very effective managing the situation, and most damagingly, seeming to kowtow or to curry favor with the electric power industry, just doing whatever TEPCO, the company that owned the Daiichi nuclear power plant, did whatever they wanted. Now, I think that's really unfair to Prime Minister Khan, because from what I've read, he really, really was trying to grapple with the situation, and he was actually demanding that the people stay in the power plant. At one point, TEPCO apparently wanted to evacuate all of its people, and he said, no, absolutely not. You must stay there. You've got to stay there, because at this point, the whole nation depends on it. If you leave, we're going to have to write off most of eastern Japan. And so maybe we've been unfair to Prime Minister Khan. Anyway, the knock-on effect of all this was that the Prime Minister Khan became just as unpopular as all these LDP prime ministers before him. And then his successor after that became equally unpopular, and that's the Fukushima disaster. And so they had their own meltdown as well. This is Prime Minister Khan. Of course, he's trying to look like he's a hands-on manager during the crisis. He's wearing a jumpsuit there. And then his successor, Noda. This is the Futenma base, by the way, in Okinawa. So they had their own meltdown, and they're pretty unpopular by the end of 2012. So what you have then is a political resurrection. A miracle takes place in 2012. Just at that point, the LDP needed a new president, and whoever is the president of the LDP becomes the prime minister should they win the election. There were 5 candidates running that year. It was the most they ever had running for the office. And Abe made all the right moves, basically. He took a very tough stance on China. There had been some hassles with China during the time the DPJ was in power, and he says, I'm going to be tough on dealing with China. He visited the Yasukuni Shrine, again, that issue, which appealed to conservatives, and said it was a mistake for him not to go there while he was prime minister. He seemed to get a lot of support from people within the party. One of his friends, Junzo Motoba, said, all of us around him, all except the politicians, told him, you have to do it again. You are the only one who can. He just has an aura about him. So apparently this guy who was written off for dead suddenly seemed like the most attractive candidate. And it also kind of indicated a shift to the right for the party, because, you know, again, this nationalist agenda that everybody knows that Abe-san is one of the best spokesmen for, it appealed to a lot of people within the party. And this was, by the way, this was his slogan, you know, Nippon o Torimodos, which means kind of something like, let's rebuild Japan, or let's reconstruct Japan, or something like that. And that was a pretty good slogan. So the LDP win in a landslide. Okay, they win 294 seats, up by 176. The DPJ, the former party which had almost as many seats, they were down to 57 seats, which was only 3 seats more than the Restoration Party, a new party which had just been formed before the election. Now, this LDP victory was probably a little less impressive than it really looked. So the turnout was the lowest since the 1996 general election, 11 million fewer voters than in 2009, and especially a lot of younger people stayed away from the election. And Abe won with less than 40% of the vote, actually. And Abe, in fact, acknowledged that the vote was less an endorsement of the LDP than an expression of despair over the DPJ. And he said it's the voters' answer to the past 3 years of political confusion. But he promised to be a hands-on prime minister who would get going immediately. He was going to make job one dealing with the economy. Okay, so his second government that he brings in at the end of 2012 is a very, very right-wing cabinet. And I mean, it was one of the most rightist LDP cabinets in a long, long time. The Economist, referring to your publication there, referred to it as a government of radical nationalists. 14 of them belonged to the League for Going to Worship Together at Yasukuni. 13 of them belong to the Nihon Kaigi, which is a nationalist think tank that advocates return to traditional values and rejects Japan's apology diplomacy, as they call it. And 9 belong to a parliamentary association that wants the teaching of history in school to give a better view of Japan's militarist past. Mr. Shimomura, who became his new education minister, wanted to rescind the 1995 Murayama statement. And Abe has said that he wants to revise 3 of the basic features, basic charters of the post-war era, which have sort of moderated Japan's nationalism. And these include the Constitution of 1946, which said that Japan will not maintain military forces, the education law, which he feels undermines the teaching of patriotism in the country, the security treaty with the United States, in which Japan plays a junior role. He wants Japan to play an equal role with the United States and be able to engage in what he calls collective security, that is, to be able to collective defense, to be able to work together with the United States. He also appointed Taro Aso, the former Japanese prime minister, to be the deputy prime minister and finance minister, and some people were comparing him to Dick Cheney, this guy who had been around in Japanese politics for a long time. But despite this really strong nationalist agenda, he decided to focus first on the economy, and that was probably a wise thing for him to do because that's what all the polls indicated people really wanted, not this nationalist stuff, which he tried to do back in 2006, 2007, but instead regrow the economy. Okay, so the economic policy is the 3 arrows, and a little more detail on that. The first one is the monetary easing, and the idea there is to get the Bank of Japan to launch an aggressive monetary easing. Okay, that is to pump as much money into the economy as possible, mostly by buying bonds and stocks and so forth, and to set an inflation target of 2% to support 2% real GDP growth. And that's these days that's pretty impressive for Japan. I mean, a very good year is when Japan grows about 1%. Secondly was to blow out the deficit temporarily, to have a huge increase in government spending just to try to stimulate the economy, but then a promise later on to rein in spending with a tax increase, a consumption tax increase. And that is, of course, where they got in trouble recently. And then the third was to be a program of reforms that was unspecified, but were to achieve growth by stimulating private investment, by freeing up so many different areas of the economy which had been regulated and controlled too much. Now, the third arrow is probably strategically the most important, the idea of trying to create a more flexible, competitive market economy in Japan. So he created 2 new bodies to advise on various kinds of reforms, and they started to work. And the problem is, though, with that third arrow is that we haven't seen much yet. Okay, there's been a lot of proposals, a lot of talk about possible reforms, but not that much in terms of real action yet. Now, why was this really, really necessary to take this action? Well, as suggested by what I've been saying, what Professor Staples was saying, there were a number of problems. You know, Japan really needed kind of a shock therapy at that time. GDP growth had averaged only 0.6% since 1991. That's a terrible record for a large economy. Consumer prices had been falling since 1995, you know, the deflation that we referred to earlier. The staggering debt load, my figure is 245% of the GDP, and Professor Staples had 230%. Anyway, whatever it was, it's a lot of money sitting out there in terms of debt. And then the idea that raising taxes alone wouldn't solve the problem. It would just create economic drag on the economy. So what you want to do is you stimulate the economy, and then you'll have more tax revenue coming in, and you can solve the deficit problem. That was the idea. Well, the early returns for this program were really, really impressive. The stock market soared in 2013. Bond yields plummeted, you know, so it was easier to buy them. The yen dropped sharply. I mean, when this whole thing started, the yen stood at the value of about 75 to the dollar, which means it only took 75 yen to buy $1. Today, you know what the rate, or I guess the rate from yesterday. Anybody exchange money yesterday? 114. Okay, that's the rate they give you in the shop. But the official rate is, I think, 117, isn't it? So, 116, okay, 116, call me a liar for 1 yen. Anyway, but 116, 117, that's a huge drop. That means it takes now 116 yen to buy 1 US dollar. So why would you want the value of the yen to go down so much? Don't you want your economy, your currency to be strong? Yeah. You know, what does that do for you?
Deficit?
Yeah.
Deficit can be one reason.
Yeah. Do you mean trade deficit or yeah?
Feeding.
Yeah. Yeah, basically it's all about trade. You want to stimulate exports because that's always been Japan's trump card is lots of exports, lots of money coming into the country, lots of jobs created in export industries. And by doing that, you can help stimulate the economy as well. You can also get more investment going because factories are humming and all of that kind of thing. Now there's a downside to that because that means that anything you import into the country becomes more expensive. So that can be a potential problem. Okay. So the early returns were really good. 2013 was a great year for the Japanese economy. It grew very strongly. Everything looked great. The structural reform, though, is a problem. And as Barry Eichenberger, who's an expert who's written a lot on the Japanese economy, he referred to it as a bent arrow. And this has been a bit of a problem. That these two advisory bodies recommended a whole bunch of things, lifting the ban on sale of non-prescription drugs, changing a point system allowed to allocate visas for skilled workers, modest changes in labor contracts, expansion of national strategic asset districts. So it was a whole bunch of small things they were going to do, but nothing really big in terms of major changes. And some of the big changes that people were advocating, especially businesses were advocating, interest group activity basically stopped them. For example, a lot of people are saying, let's free up the agriculture markets so we can just import whatever we want from any other country. And that was basically stopped cold by the farmers' cooperatives and so on. So that wasn't going to be done. Changing labor markets in a big way to allow people to change jobs and create more flexibility in labor markets, that was largely stopped by a lot of labor unions and so on. So that didn't get going. So the focus kind of changed this past year into what Abe calls womenomics. Okay, so that'll be the magic bullet. What we'll do is we'll just change everything. We got this untapped pool of workers out there, mainly females, who are being underutilized. Let's make conditions better for women. And so, what were some of the things they were going to? So Abe promoted 5 different women to be ministers in his cabinet. That was going to be like a symbolic move. Well, that didn't work out so well because 2 of them had to resign recently because of scandals. So, okay, well, scratch that one. The labor ministry said that companies should, that is, large companies should declare numerical targets for women managers. Okay, so they're recommending they do that. They want to expand daycare. To create 200,000 new spots and then create after-school programs for 300,000 children. Problem with these things is, we don't have a plan yet, and there's a lot of talk, and everybody's impressed. Even the First Lady got into the thing talking about how important women are and so forth. But it wouldn't affect most of the economy because it wouldn't affect where most people work, which is small and medium enterprises. These would only apply to like large companies. 5 minutes? Okay, great. And most importantly, this doesn't attack the fundamental problems of why women don't do well in the Japanese economy. What are the basic problems? Why can't women get promoted? Why can't women have careers in Japan? Well, it's the ingrained business culture in Japan, which says basically that women are supposed to work for a few years, and when they get married or have their first child, they retire, basically. Now, they can come back at some later point and be part-time workers or temporary workers or something like that when their kids go off to school, but they never really get back onto any kind of a career track, and then eventually they leave the workforce again. So it's often called an M-shaped curve to women's careers. Okay, they're kind of rising, the first part of the M, and then they have to leave the workforce for a long time while they have kids. That's the lower part of the M. And then they kind of come back into the workforce, and then they have to leave again. And Also, most of the business practices are not friendly to women with children. What are people supposed to do? You know, you're supposed to work very long hours, and for no particular rational reason. It's just because everybody else is in the office. And then once the workday is over, you have to go out and drink with your colleagues. So you don't get home till maybe midnight, and then you're expected to be in the office the next day at 9 o'clock in the morning working all day again. How can you raise kids with that kind of a situation? You know, it's very female unfriendly. How can they break up that culture? So that's the real issue. So in the interest of time, kind of running out of time, I'll just quickly go through the rest of it. Obvious foreign policy also has been trying to reach out to a lot of other Asian countries. Won't get into too much detail on that in the interest of time. And trying to strengthen the American alliance by cooperating more as a partner with the United States. Now, Japan's kind of current issues that it probably needs to think about very seriously, in addition to everything we've already talked about, are, I think Professor Staples was talking about, the demographic problem and the healthcare problem that are all kind of linked. The reconstruction of the Tohoku area, which is still, they've cleared out most of the debris, but the reconstruction has been very, very slow in that region. What to do about nuclear power, another issue he mentioned in his presentation. They really need nuclear power, but it's very unpopular at this point. Do you restart the nuclear plants, which Prime Minister Abe has promised to do? Or do you refrain from doing that? Just go non-nuclear like Germany has decided to do. And do you keep this current kind of business-oriented culture that the LDP has relied on so much? Maybe we should move beyond that. And then for the future issues are linked to the issues of the present. You have a declining workforce, and you're having fewer young people entering the workforce every day, and it's a much more competitive environment for them, and a lot of them are not likely to have strong careers in the future. And what are you going to do about women's issue? What are you going to do about these guys? This is probably the most important group in Japan. Japanese people are not making these anymore. That's the problem they have. How do you get Japanese people to start making these little guys? Again, they have one of the lowest birth rates in the world. I think Korea's is actually lower than theirs, 1.4 fertility rate in Japan. And of course, these guys are greatly increasing, as Professor Staples mentioned. And how do you deal with a society that is over a third retirees? Maybe that's another untapped group of workers you can use, because people from about 65 to 75, called the young elderly, they can usually keep working, and you can use them. And they can have a more fulfilling life if they actually go out and work a few hours a day. So why not use them? And a lot of people are very healthy into their 80s. Let them continue working a few hours a week or something like that, instead of just putting them out to pasture. I mean, Japan has the longest life expectancy in the world, right? So why not use them? And I think that's about it. So in the interest of time, I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you all very much. Do you have any questions or anything? Thank you. Yeah.